Muy buenas tardes. Sean bienvenidos al coloquio U.S. Foreign Policy Towards Latin America in the 21st Century, la política exterior de Estados Unidos hacia América Latina en el siglo XXI. Y como figura central de este coloquio hemos invitado a una personalidad muy distinguida del mundo académico y de servicio público. Se trata de Richard Feinberg, quien se desempeñó en altas posiciones dentro del Departamento de Estado y el Consejo Nacional de Seguridad, organismo adscrito a la Casa Blanca. También es profesor de Economía Internacional de la Universidad de California en San Diego y asesor del Council on Foreign Relations. Su presencia es hoy fundamental para descifrar las claves de la política exterior de Estados Unidos hacia América Latina en este siglo. El Inter-American Institute for Democracy es un tanque de pensamiento privado, sin fines de lucro, integrado por personas que creen que la libertad es la piedra angular del desarrollo humano. Son hombres y mujeres de diversas profesiones, antecedentes e inclinaciones ideológicas. Los une la defensa de la libertad en todas sus dimensiones y el respeto al orden democrático en todas las latitudes de nuestro continente. Cuenta con un fondo editorial dedicado a divulgar ideas y propuestas que definen la democracia y expanden la libertad. Hoy nos convoca en este segundo coloquio del año 2024 un tema de gran impacto para el futuro del continente, la política exterior de los Estados Unidos y América Latina en este vapuleado y vapuleante siglo XXI. Tenemos el proyecto de cubrir el siguiente programa. Habrá una introducción a cargo del embajador Mariano Caucino. Luego participarán como orador principal, por supuesto, tenemos a Richard Feinberg. Y participan Ricardo Israel, Iliana Lavastida, Luis Fleischman, Francisco Santos, Rodrigo Arboleda, Rodolfo Milani y Francisco Endara Daza y Carlos Sánchez Berzaín. Los coloquios en el Inter-American Institute for Democracy se realizan bajo la conducción de un director. No ofrecen conclusiones. Y en el formato hay una exposición que plantea un tema hasta por 15 minutos. Y luego los participantes realizan preguntas o aportes en intervenciones de 3 minutos. Los aportes deben ser hechos sobre la base de lo expuesto por el coloquiante. Antes de darle el derecho de palabra al embajador Caucino, para que dé inicio a nuestro programa, voy a compartir con ustedes 3 citas de 3 presidentes de Estados Unidos que marcaron la política exterior de los Estados Unidos hacia América Latina en el siglo XX. Franklin Delano Roosevelt indicó, "In the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor, the neighbor who resolutely respects himself and because he does so, respects the rights of others, the neighbor who respects obligation and respects the sanctity of his agreements, and with a world of neighbors." Cierro la cita. John F. Kennedy, por su parte, dijo, abro cita, "We propose to complete the revolution of the Americas, to build a hemisphere where all men can hope for a suitable standard of living, and all can live both their lives in dignity and freedom." Cierro la cita. George Bush Sr. dijo, abro la cita, "In the Americas we are constructing a hopeful model of the new post-Cold War world of which we dream. This is the first hemisphere, and the OAS is the first regional organization in the world to take on through the Santiago Declaration the formal collective responsibility to defend democracy. And in this hemisphere, the weapons of mass destruction, strategic missiles, as well as nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons have been rejected voluntarily. And in this hemisphere, we have created new models of multilateral cooperation and success in resolving the conflicts that tormented Central America and carry weight in the economies of the region." Cierro comilla. Las 3 citas reflejan un contenido de política exterior marcado por los principios de la colaboración, la protección de la libertad y la cooperación en materia de desarrollo. ¿Serán estos los principios rectores de la diplomacia norteamericana en el siglo XXI? Voy entonces ahora a pedirle a nuestro miembro de la Junta Directiva y el embajador Caucino que por favor dirija las palabras de apertura. El embajador Caucino es un distinguidísimo académico de Buenos Aires, es de nacionalidad argentina, fue egresado de la Universidad de Buenos Aires y además ha sido embajador de su país en Israel y pronto será embajador en otro país porque está postulado, pero no podemos revelar ese secreto todavía. Bienvenido, embajador.
Muchas gracias a las autoridades del Inter-American Institute for Democracy por permitirme presentar este seminario que una vez más reúne a personas destacadas de las Américas para discutir siempre temas centrales para que hacen al quehacer de nuestros países y nuestros pueblos. Por razones geográficas, culturales e históricas, las relaciones entre los Estados Unidos y los países de las Américas han sido decisivas. Ustedes saben que a lo largo del tiempo estas relaciones han sido amistosas, han sido controvertidas, han sido conflictivas o han sido cuestionadas. Pero lo cierto es que este país, la democracia más establecida del mundo, ha sido ejemplo para muchos de nuestros países en la idea de conformar repúblicas democráticas, respetuosas de la dignidad humana, y en ese sentido siempre ha sido un faro de libertad para todos nosotros. Lamentablemente, cuando creíamos hace 30 años que la democracia estaba conseguida, conquistada en la enorme mayoría de nuestros países y solamente quedaba un país bajo un gobierno dictatorial, que era Cuba, y parecía que Cuba iba a democratizarse pronto, esas esperanzas fueron frustradas y, como ustedes saben, a lo largo de los últimos 30 años, sobre todo en los últimos 15 o 20 años, han reaparecido dictaduras a partir del llamado socialismo del siglo XXI, y al menos hoy hay por lo menos 4 países en manos de dictaduras. Por eso la política exterior norteamericana es tan importante para analizar esta cuestión, y me es muy grato poder presentar este panel en el cual se va a tratar este tema tan decisivo para la historia de nuestros pueblos, para la historia de nuestros países, con oradores muy destacados de las distintas naciones que componen nuestras Américas, y a los que nos une bajo los auspicios de este instituto siempre la idea de la defensa de la libertad, la democracia, los derechos humanos y la dignidad del hombre. Muchas gracias y les dejo con los oradores.
Le damos las gracias al embajador Caucino y corresponde ahora el derecho de palabra a nuestro conferencista invitado, el doctor Richard Feinberg. El doctor Feinberg es profesor de Economía Política Internacional en la Escuela de Graduados de Relaciones Internacionales y Estudios del Pacífico de la Universidad de California en San Diego. Ha escrito extensamente sobre finanzas y comercio internacional y las relaciones entre Estados Unidos y América Latina. Y su último libro es Summitry in the Americas. Ha sido ejecutor y creador de la política exterior de los Estados Unidos para el hemisferio a lo largo de 4 décadas, abarcando servicios gubernamentales tanto en la Casa Blanca como el Departamento de Estado y el Departamento del Tesoro, así como en numerosos institutos de políticas públicas con sede en Washington. Bienvenido, Dr. Feinberg.
Thank you, Beatrice. Are you going to start the video for me?
I think you have to start.
It tells me that you're blocking my video.
No.
¿Pasó? Dice que está bloqueado el video.
Okay, there we go.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. Really, it's a great honor to be with the Institute and such a very distinguished group of panelists. Great honor. And Beatrice, let me congratulate you on your recent article on the resilience of Chilean democracy, which I thought was really quite brilliant. And I suggest, if you haven't already, to circulate it to everyone listening to this session. So let me begin with a confession. I am an optimist. I see a glass half full, and I reject the mainstream negative narrative of the hemisphere that emphasizes widespread democratic backsliding and debilitating economic stagnation. In judging progress, it depends on the metrics, right? And I always tell my students, set a low bar. Set a low bar. You're more likely to achieve success and to reach happiness. Utopian goals are too often the bane of Latin American politics, and that's the path to frustration and disillusionment. I have 50 years perspective now on inter-American relations. I see some gray-haired panelists that have a similar perspective. And I would maintain that for most, if not all, Latin American families today, compared to 30, 50 years ago, living conditions have improved immeasurably in many countries, dramatically so. And as mentioned already, in most places, pluralistic democracy is the only game in town. Most younger folks throughout the region have only lived under democratic governments. That is the only game that they are aware of and see as possible and as probable. So let me say that the Institute, as an institute and as individuals, you have good reasons to celebrate these historic advances. Don't allow the naysayers to deprive you of your honors, your well-deserved honors. Okay, U.S. leverage today is less than it was. Of course, we're in a more multilateral world. U.S. prestige was at its apogee after World War II and at the end of the Cold War, when it was needed most in the hemisphere, when the region was transitioning from closed authoritarian states to more liberal democratic societies and more open economies. The U.S. was there in many countries at critical moments to assist definitively, successfully, to assist local reformers. But now, local institutions are stronger in most countries. They can stand tall largely on their own foundations. Okay, we are all terribly aware of important exceptions to these arcs of progress. We all know these cases. Some of you from your own personal, painful, traumatic experiences. We've seen that years, in some cases decades, of fierce economic sanctions imposed by the United States and in some cases by others. These intense, prolonged economic sanctions have not succeeded. Instead of driving transitions to democracy, what we find is stubborn authoritarian resilience. We find authoritarian regimes, despite minority popular support, can still maintain themselves in power. They can control state resources. They have loyal political organizations. They have a pervasive security apparatus armed with modern surveillance techniques. Political realism, therefore, requires us to recognize these adverse trends and to pose some new creative approaches beyond just more and more economic sanctions, which have not produced the desired results. Now, economics, we didn't get the FTAA, okay, as initially suggested, as was pointed out by Beatrice, by Bush Sr. But the region is interlaced with dozens of free trade agreements. And the United States has free trade agreements with Mexico, Central America, and the Pacific coast of South America. That's all positive developments. But we find throughout much of the region, in economics, stronger policymaking, better educated policymakers, much more stable monetary policies in most countries, more flexible exchange rates, much more public policy transparency. We find both stronger states and stronger markets, and vast improvements in social services as we approach the UN Sustainable Development Goals in many countries, even as we have to recognize this recent setbacks from COVID-19. Now, in trade policy, in both the United States, both political parties, Democrats and Republicans, now seem to be drifting towards a trade skepticism, tilting towards greater protectionism. Okay, so let's not talk anymore about trade liberalization. Let's not talk about FDI. Let's talk about global value chains. Let's talk about friendshoring. Let's talk about nearshoring, because these are so evidently in the national interest of the United States. Nearshoring, global value chains, is the most creative, affirmative response to Chinese competition. And the US has begun to move in that direction of incentivizing regional global supply chains, nearshoring, if you will. And to that extent, I recommend the recent article that appeared just yesterday in Foreign Affairs magazine by Shannon O'Neill on the opportunities for nearshoring in inter-American relations, potentially transformative. And in the area of international value chains, policies which were controversial just 10 years ago are now mainstream, that global supply chains must honor internationally recognized labor standards, they must respect the environment, and advance gender equity. All big advances in the trade and investment space. Now, it is often lamented that the US doesn't pay enough attention to the region. Well, as initially mentioned, by the way, by Beatrice, gracias a Dios, in this region, there's no threatening nuclear weapons, no vicious Hamas, no interstate wars that demand our attention. Yeah, sure, the US could do better, could put more attention to the region, but responsibility for inter-American diplomacy must be shared. A more activist United States in the region would need more willing and able partners. But let's look around, frankly. Today, the Mexican president is proudly parochial. He never travels. Brazil imagines it can solve conflicts in Central Europe and in the Middle East, turning its back on its own hemisphere where it formerly imagined that it could be a leader. And Argentina, bueno, quién sabe. In contrast to that situation in the Americas, if a US president flies to Europe and NATO, if a US president flies to Tokyo or Seoul or to ASEAN, he can anticipate warm welcomes and willing, eager allies. That's what we don't have in the inter-American system. And therefore, to argue that the US should spend more time and more effort and more capital, political capital on the region would require more affirmative response and more capabilities and willingness in the region itself. Okay, so what do we have in terms of inter-American relations? And this will be my last major point. In response to this fragmented, contentious hemisphere, the US has evolved what I would call a multi-tiered multilateralism. You have inclusive multilateralism, you have plurilateralism, and then you have traditional bilateralism. I described this, by the way, in a recent article in the Wilson Quarterly. You have the universal institutions, the OAS and the IDB. Perhaps they don't have the clout that they had in their earlier, more formative years. But the OAS was important in the recent defense of democracy in Guatemala. And how exciting was that? Compare that to all the travails of Guatemala famously in 54 and in the early 90s, 80s and 90s. So the OAS was very dramatic and a beautiful example there of multi-pronged diplomacy and safeguarding democracy in Guatemala. The IDB is now under competent Brazilian leadership. It will help finance the important energy transition to cleaner energy. And then the third pillar of universal multilateralism, IDB, OAS, is Summitry. Summitry engages the head of state. We're coming upon the 30th anniversary of the first Summit of the Americas, you all remember, in Miami in 1994. And in 2025, we will have the 10th Summit of the Americas. And the summits, some are good, some are mediocre, but they have given us some moments of high drama, and they have made their contributions. When ideological fragmentation across nations makes inclusive cooperation, full multilateralism, not possible, the US diplomats turn to plurilateralism, to sub-regional accords. Recent examples at the Los Angeles Summit of the Americas last year, in 2022, we had plurilateral agreements on migration, which, if you read them, actually are pretty substantive. And then we had the launching of the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity, APEC, which is intended to promote nearshoring. We'll see if that can actually make real progress on the ground, because we have within the administration, we much recognize the foot dragging of Catherine Tai at USTR, which represents the more protectionist wing of the Democratic Party and the Biden administration. And I would say she's made it difficult for APEC to really move forward. But it's out there, and it's something that I keep urging my friends in Latin America to grab and run with. Now, that's plurilateralism. We still, of course, have bilateralism, and they are the great example. Trilateralism with the USMCA. I live on the border here in San Diego, and the relationships with Mexico are complex, very multifaceted, very intense on a daily basis. Itself a topic for a long seminar. And then other issues that are handled mostly bilaterally: counter-narcotics, cybersecurity, mostly bilateral. So, to summarize my talk, Beatrice, I think did I stick to my 15 minutes? To summarize
time. You still have time.
What's that?
You still have time. You have 5 more minutes.
Well, I'll do better than that, leave more time for my fellow panelists, and then we can have more of a discussion. But to summarize, inter-American relations rests on the foundations of liberal democracy, more open markets, both stronger states and stronger markets. Authoritarian resilience in some countries is real, and policy failures by the international community suggest the need for some fresh approaches. Meanwhile, inter-American relations have evolved a flexible menu of instruments, including inclusive multilateralism, plurilateralism, and our standard bilateralism. Going forward, the hemisphere has a very rich agenda. We have the restructuring of global trade and investment, of global value chains, nearshoring, tremendous, which could transform inter-American relations and really integrate it in a very meaningful and dynamic way across a number of important sectors. Immigration, which I haven't really spent much time on. It's a very big polarizing issue. But, after all is said and done, the U.S. continues to admit over 1 million immigrants a year legally. And that's so we, despite all the negative press and some of the rhetoric from some quarters, the U.S. still remains a relatively open society. And then the other big topic, of course, is climate change and clean energy. And there, the hemisphere has huge advantages: natural resources, minerals, wind, and sunshine in abundance. So looking forward on the issues of global value chains, on movements of peoples, and of climate change, the potential for really creative and deep inter-American cooperation is all very real. So Beatrice, thank you very much for this opportunity. Looking forward to engage with our distinguished panelists in the remainder of the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Richard. We are now going to open then this conversation, and our first expert is Dr. Ricardo Israel, who's a member of our board at the IID, and he's also the chair of our publishing fund, and also of the Committee for Democracy. Dr. Israel is a lawyer. He graduated in the University of Chile. And he has a master in government affairs and public policies, and a doctorate in political sciences from the University of Essex in England.
Thank you. In relation to Dr. Feinberg's words, I want to say the following, summarized in 5 major points. First, the main characteristic of United States foreign policy to Latin America in this century is the lack of a state policy. Policies which change abruptly from one government to the other. And from the point of view of Latin America, the main consequence is the increasing geopolitical irrelevance of the region, to which there have been no reaction not even for security reasons, not even for China and Russia. Different to the 90s, there are no policies to be followed from one government to the other. This is not happening only in relation to Latin America, but almost in every important area, including Ukraine and Israel, but is strongly felt as a consequence in the region. Second, there is no major historical joint project, and the difference is clear and shown by a comparison of the first summit of the Americas, one very dear to Dr. Feinberg, which happened in Miami in 1994, to the last one in Los Angeles last year. Miami offered a path to a common market in economic development supported by two governments, Bush Sr. and Clinton's, and democracy as the political system. Third, both are to blame, not only USA, but also Latin America. To start with, Latin America rejected as a region the offer at the time of the 90s, and at that time, the only dictatorship was Cuba. Today there are four, and the number is increasing more than decreasing. Fourth, in the region, there has been a clear recoil in relation to democracy, as well as, and this is new, there has been a Latin Americanization of politics in the United States, polarization, division, cultural war, and the almost impossibility to have any bipartisan policy in relation to the region. The problem is the United States is still the main superpower in the world. Fifth, China. This is a major change. The economic power of China makes it a very different challenge to the one of the Soviet Union last century. And Beijing is set to replace United States as the sole power of the world, and they also have a date for that. The century of the proclamation of the People's Republic by Mao Zedong. That is to say, October the 1st, 2049. We can be sure of the intentions because China is following what United States did to England last century, step by step. What to do? I forward rapidly three ideas. Both Latin America and United States need to recover state policy as a base of their relationship. From dictatorships in Latin America, the respect to the White House has been lost. And mostly in Latin America, there are no consequences for wrong behavior. Secondly, the second idea is needed to have an automatic response to the dictatorship, mostly those where the government is in the hands of organized crime. Today, there is an automatic response to military takeover, which is more a problem of last century, but the region is not prepared for this 21st century type of dictatorship like Venezuela. And lastly, a new relationship probably will start by being fully aware of the historical opportunity that was lost in the 90s, but also it cannot go forward if it's, as it happened today in Washington, centered only in two subjects, illegal immigration and drugs. And thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Now we have the pleasure and the honor to welcome Iliana Lavastida, who is one of the most respected journalists in South Florida. She's the director of Diario Las Américas, which is the dean of the Hispanic media in this country. And she's also a person who highly respected among the Hispanic communities here because of her defense of freedom and democracy throughout the region. Welcome, Iliana.
Buenas tardes, gracias a Beatrice, gracias al Instituto Interamericano por la Democracia, por la convocatoria de este foro. aprovechándonos de el uso de los dos idiomas en Miami, voy a hacer mi exposición en en español, que es mi idioma madre y el que me desempeño con más propiedad. La política exterior de Estados Unidos hacia Latinoamérica en el presente siglo es el tema que nos mueve a la reflexión hoy en este coloquio organizado por el Instituto Interamericano para la Democracia. En mi opinión, consiste en un tema siempre recurrente y necesario, pues si bien no soy de quienes intentan responsabilizar a Estados Unidos de todo cuanto ocurre, sí estoy convencida de que todo lo que decimos o todo lo que se hace en la primera potencia del mundo, Latinoamérica lo toma como referencia, no solo por el poderío militar, económico y científico de este país, sino porque simplemente la mayoría de los países lo toman como espejo. De ahí la importancia no solo de las políticas hacia la región, también de las posiciones de Estados Unidos respecto a determinadas situaciones que acontecen en nuestros países. Con apenas mencionar ejemplos, podemos ilustrar el sustento de esta afirmación que hago. En el caso de Cuba, decisiones adoptadas por administraciones estadounidenses en el siglo XX aún repercuten en la actualidad de este continente. Comencemos por mencionar un suceso de la década del 60 del siglo pasado, la fallida invasión a Bahía de Cochinos que le ofreció a Fidel Castro el pretexto para proclamar la implantación de un Estado socialista a solo 90 millas de Estados Unidos, con el respaldo de una potencia enemiga, la entonces Unión Soviética. Más adelante en la historia, la expansión de este sistema a otras naciones del continente y con ello la aparición de la tabla de salvación que permitiera al régimen de La Habana sobrevivir a la desaparición del socialismo como sistema en la década del 90, lo alcanzó Cuba con la alianza establecida entre Castro y Chávez, que dio paso a la llamada corriente del socialismo del siglo XXI. Y dando saltos en la historia, porque no es posible en minutos resumir acontecimientos de manera pormenorizada, en paralelo al surgimiento de la existencia de la llamada corriente del siglo XXI en Venezuela, la nación que con su riqueza ha brindado sostén a la transnacional del crimen organizado, como lo hemos definido aquí en varios foros, desde la propia Venezuela también, desde Cuba y Nicaragua, otros enemigos de los valores que representa y defiende Estados Unidos han expandido sus influencias, se han posesionado, se han aprovechado de las ventajas económicas y se han fortalecido. Hablamos de enemigos de Estados Unidos de tanto cuidado como China, Irán, Rusia, que en ciertos países de la región son vistos y tratados como aliados. Hagamos un alto para citar ejemplos concretos. La zona conocida como Arco Minero Venezolano, donde se concentran yacimientos de oro, diamante, coltán y otros minerales estratégicos con los que se fabrican elementos para la industria electrónica, desde hace mucho tiempo, según se ha denunciado, la cúpula que controla ese país le ha concedido a China, Irán y Rusia la explotación de muchos de esos yacimientos mineros estratégicos. En Nicaragua, con el pretexto de fabricar un canal interoceánico, Ortega le cedió a China una importante franja de tierra, para lo cual desplazó y masacró poblaciones indígenas. En Cuba, a donde el canciller ruso Sergei Lavrov ha visitado en fecha reciente unas 9 veces, el régimen ha ofrecido a Rusia la base aérea de San Antonio de los Baños, ubicada en el occidente del país, y según revelara en fecha reciente un programa transmitido por un canal de YouTube donde da informaciones que recibe de manera confidencial de Cuba el influencer Juan Almeida, con información suministrada desde Cuba. En la región central de la isla le cedieron también a Rusia el puerto de Casilda, que tiene una posición estratégica para acceder a países de Latinoamérica. Y entonces la información emitida plantea que Cuba, o sea, la que se filtró desde Cuba, le está cediendo estos territorios estratégicos geográficamente a Rusia, en parte para saldar la deuda que tiene La Habana con Moscú. En una entrevista concedida esta semana a Diario Las Américas por el coronel retirado del Ejército de Estados Unidos, Octavio Pérez, este oficial y analista político definía el papel que representan en el ajedrez político internacional a favor de los enemigos de Estados Unidos regímenes como los de Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia. Tampoco descartó Brasil y México, que sin ser regímenes o dictaduras les hacen el juego a estos gobiernos. Y decía: Estos países son peones en ese ajedrez, algunos más eficientes y de mayor importancia que otros, pero sin dudas piezas de un juego a los que Estados Unidos no debe perder de vista, porque en circunstancias determinadas, solo con enarbolar la bandera del antiimperialismo les aparecen aliados. Buenas tardes.
Bueno, agradecemos esta presentación a Iliana y ahora le vamos a dar el derecho de palabra al doctor Luis Fleischman, que es miembro de la Junta Directiva del Inter-American Institute for Democracy y es profesor del Palm Beach State College, es doctor en Ciencias Políticas y es de origen uruguayo. Bienvenido, Luis.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. I really appreciate your introduction. I actually heard the words of Professor Feinberg, and he claims that liberal democracy is still alive and kicking in the continent. The states are stronger than before, and the markets are also stronger than before. I have to disagree, with all due respect, with Professor Feinberg. But this is why I see at this moment. The Biden administration's foreign policy is currently focused on two main issues. First is the crisis on the southern border, and the second is the increasing influence of China in the region. And of course, this is, I understand the policies that the United States is carrying out, like improving the economic and social conditions of these countries, the encouragement of private sectors, American corporate investments, training of locals to prevent child labor, vaccines for COVID-19, food programs. All this, I think, is very good. In terms of trying to counteract or counterbalance the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, the Biden administration initiated, and Dr. Feinberg mentioned it, the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, which is a US-led forum to bolster regional investment. I doubt that the United States at this point is capable of competing with the Belt and Road Initiative in the region. I think the Chinese are well established and well rooted in the region, but I think that the effort by President Biden is worth the while. Now, with regard to the issue of democracy, okay, the U.S. has had a policy of democracy promotion for decades, and I think Dr. Feinberg actually has been one of the key witnesses of those policies since the era of Bush the First through Bill Clinton and others. Now, but I think that this policy requires reevaluation. As an example, in countries where democracy formally exists, it should continue to support the consolidation of democracy and public accountability. The US should make sure that leaders such as Javier Milei, who intends to fight corruption and reconstruct the Argentinian state, consolidates a democracy with proper division of powers, independence of judges, and transparency. The United States can definitely advise on this, has a lot to offer. In countries where democracy does not exist, the US should continue to support transitions as much as it can, although I frankly do not expect Maduro to give up his rule over Venezuela. The administration has imposed new sanctions on Cuba and Nicaragua. Frankly, I don't know how much these sanctions are going to work. In this sense, I agree with Dr. Feinberg.
Luis, te queda un minuto.
Venezuela to pressure the Maduro government to negotiate a transition. And now it has resumed them after Maduro disqualified Maria Corina Machado. That is good. But here is another problem that Dr. Feinberg mentioned. He claims that Latin America has stronger states. And this is probably one of my biggest points of contention. Precisely, one of the biggest problems the region faces is the problem of multiple sovereignty. Governments do not have a monopoly over the means of violence because transnational crime and their accomplices have accumulated more power than the government. There is an anarchical situation that might well convert the region into another Afghanistan, a region dominated by warlords and infiltrated by terrorist groups. The FARC dissidents, the ELN and Hezbollah already have a strong presence in the region, and their presence is likely to increase. Not to speak about the influx of
Luis, Luis, ¿no te quedas?
And their support for authoritarian regimes. Yes, Beatrice, I'm sorry.
30 segundos.
Okay, let me, I'm going to finish in a moment. So I believe, and this is probably one of my most important points, at this point we have a president in El Salvador that is cracking down on transnational crime. I think it's extremely important to crack down on transnational crime. I am aware that Bukele actually crossed the lines by detaining people that shouldn't have been detained, by having long administrative detentions. But on the other hand, is providing an important service to the people that elected him. And now he was elected with 85% of the population. Ecuador is facing the same problem, and more countries are going to face the same problem. So, and this is my light point. Transnational crime is not an opposition party. It is a subversive group that eats the state like cancer. Fighting gangs is a war. It is like fighting terrorism. And fighting terrorism allows for administrative detention. Even democratic countries use these measures when they face terrorism. And this is where I think the United States can contribute. I think it should support the efforts to fight and defeat transnational crime, but at the same time, the United States has the capability to advise this country how to do it within the framework of the law. That means everything should be legal. Administrative detentions should not be indefinite. House arrest, no military trials, right? With convictions based on secretive evidence. Nothing like that. That means the United States can provide advice on how to fight transnational crime while maintaining the law. And I think Colombia, a plan that Dr. Feinberg is very familiar with, actually has succeeded in that.
Luis, estás requete pasado. Gracias. Ok, ahora le vamos a dar la bienvenida a un miembro de nuestra junta directiva, don Francisco Santos, que es periodista de profesión, vicepresidente de Colombia por 8 años consecutivos bajo la administración Uribe. Infatigable luchador por la libertad y destacada pluma en publicaciones como Infobae, Semana y El Tiempo. Y algo que muy pocos políticos pueden exhibir como credencial, ha sido víctima del crimen organizado transnacional que lo secuestró y casi pone fin a su vida. Bienvenido, Francisco. No te oímos.
Prende el audio.
Audio.
Está muteado.
Ya. Muchas gracias. Y es una placer estar en este foro, Beatrice. Yo tuve el privilegio de ver 2 momentos de la política exterior americana hacia América Latina de primera mano. Como vicepresidente entre el 2002 y el 2010 en pleno Plan Colombia, y como embajador entre el 2018 y el 2021 con la extinción del Plan Colombia. Y en el entretanto ver cómo era de exitosa la política de Estados Unidos de cierta manera, con problemas, etcétera, entre el 2002 y el 2010, y cómo fue de desastrosa a partir de entonces, cediendo espacios y generando, digamos, distintas transformaciones que se dieron dentro de Estados Unidos y que afectaron la política exterior de Estados Unidos hacia Venezuela, por ejemplo. Entre el 2002 y el 2010 me tocó venir a Estados Unidos, me tocó ir a Estados Unidos, yo les diría que 50, 60 veces, a poner la cara. Yo era la persona responsable de derechos humanos. Plan Colombia, cómo se transformó el Plan Colombia en una lucha contra la criminalidad, que luego se convirtió en un tema antisubversivo, porque estaba mezclado, porque no se podían separar. Cómo había una accountability permanente frente al Senado, frente a la Cámara, cómo con Patrick Leahy, cómo era una política binacional, o sea, y bipartidista, y cómo existía skin in the game, como decimos como dicen los americanos, pues del Plan Colombia solo representó el 10% del gasto que se hizo. Colombia puso el 90% de ese gasto entre el 2002 y el 2010. Se redujeron las hectáreas de coca dramáticamente. Las organizaciones criminales quedaron totalmente diluidas. Muchas en Venezuela viviendo y fortaleciéndose. Unas partes en Ecuador, aunque logramos hacer varios operativos allá, pero era un tema de donde uno veía una política de Estado de Estados Unidos hacia un país que en el 2002 iba a ser un Estado fallido y en el 2010 era la estrella de la economía y de la seguridad en América Latina. A partir de entonces empiezo yo a ver cómo cambian las cosas. Cambia el gobierno, el presidente Santos empieza su gobierno y de pronto empieza a cambiar la política antidrogas y la transforma totalmente ante un silencio absoluto del gobierno. Desmontaron la política de drogas, tanto que pasamos de tener 40.000 hectáreas, porque él la mantuvo los primeros 2 años y bajó de 70.000 a 40.000 hectáreas. Si hubiera seguido, hoy tendríamos un remanente muy pequeño. La desmontó e inmediatamente subimos a 200.000 hectáreas de coca, con total complicidad del gobierno Obama, y no tengo que decirlo, en parte del gobierno Trump, que tenía otros problemas en esos momentos y no se fijó de esto. Segundo, hay un proceso de paz con las FARC, ya hay un plebiscito y en el plebiscito se dice no, y se viola ese plebiscito, que además es lo más importante, es una decisión democrática única, y frente a esto Estados Unidos guardó silencio. Nunca dijo absolutamente nada. No quiso defender la administración Obama, la democracia y el peso del voto de un ciudadano y un voto en un tema tan decisivo como era este. Llego a Estados Unidos en el 2018, ya esos cambios, la política hacia Cuba había dado un viraje y me encuentro con muchas cosas. Primero, la política hacia América Latina se maneja desde la Casa Blanca. El Departamento de Estado ya juega un papel mucho menor. Eso se ha mantenido en la administración Biden. Se crean unas condiciones que creo que sirvieron muchísimo. En el tema de Venezuela se logra crear un gobierno paralelo reconocido por 60 países. Nunca eso había pasado. Nunca habíamos tenido semejante oportunidad de construir algo paralelo frente a una dictadura. Ya quisieran los iraníes en resistencia, ya quisieran todos los que tienen, los mismos cubanos, tener un gobierno paralelo dentro del país. Las restricciones, es más, las sanciones sirvieron. Y tengo aquí que ser muy franco, el deterioro.
Te queda un minuto.
Las sanciones fueron, pero frente a esto se cambia la administración, encuentra uno un Congreso que no tenía capacidad de tener una política común, no se hablaban. Lo mismo pasó con el gobierno desechó este gobierno paralelo que se había logrado, empezó a negociar, les devolvió al EXAP, relajó dramáticamente las sanciones y la situación no mejoró, empeoró. Entonces, lo que yo veo es un país tremendamente dividido y una América Latina que se está narcotizando. México, Venezuela es un narcoestado, México, la mitad de México es un narcoestado. Lo que pasó en Ecuador no es casualidad. Uno va ya a Argentina, a Brasil, a Perú y empieza a encontrar toda esa criminalidad mexicana involucrada con criminalidad latinoamericana, y no ve una política de Estados Unidos seria frente a esto. Y si no hay una política seria frente a esto, lo único que va a seguir pasando es que va a haber inmigración, va a haber deslegitimación, va a haber debilidad institucional y Estados Unidos va a tener un infierno del Río Grande para abajo. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias a Francisco Santos por esas reflexiones. Ahora le vamos a dar el derecho de palabra al doctor Eduardo Gamarra. Eduardo Gamarra es profesor titular de Ciencias Políticas en el Departamento de Política y Relaciones Internacionales de la Universidad Internacional de la Florida, FIU. Ha estado en FIU desde 1986, donde también dirigió el Centro Latinoamericano y del Caribe de 1994 al 2007. Es el director del Latino Public Opinion Forum. Bienvenido, Eduardo.
Muchas gracias, Beatriz, y es un placer saludar a Richard quien no veo hace muchísimos años, y en gran medida pues tuve el privilegio de participar con él en esa primera cumbre de las Américas. Eh, voy a pasar al inglés para poder responderle mejor a Richard y así entrar en la conversación con todos. Eh, en primer lugar, let me say the following, Richard. It's always, that old distinction between an optimist and a pessimist that that often is alluded to, which is, an optimist is a pessimist with information, right? And I would love to say that is the case in with you, given your extraordinary experience, your extraordinary amount of influence that you've had over several administrations. That said, however, I have to, in some measure, contradict many of the things that you have said this afternoon, even though I welcome this optimism in a hemisphere that is extraordinarily complex. But let me just say the following, and I'm going to focus specifically on the Biden administration. Just, analyzing this administration involves understanding a series of very complex and dynamic factors that intertwine both with recent history, geopolitical changes, and the internal challenges of the region. And so I would say that, this administration in particular has been, like all, right? It's been affected by the context that it inherited, this post-Cold War, or whatever you want to call it, framework, and the current challenges of the region. And so let me just simply say that over this historical framework, if you will, really has to deal with the following. And that is, in the first place, after the end of the Cold War, we experienced very significant changes with very important transitions to democracy in several nations. But as several of my colleagues have already pointed out, right, I strongly disagree with you, Richard, that liberal democracy is fine. I think that liberal democracy is threatened in the region by both the right and the left. This isn't an ideological discussion. This is the trend, and it's an overwhelming trend away from liberal democracy in the context in which an administration is still about promoting democracy, not only in Latin America, but worldwide. And in large measure, of course, I would even go as far as saying that liberal representative democracy is also fundamentally challenged, even in the United States and in other parts of the world. And so when we look at this in a more global sense, right, representative democracy appears to be in a very, very I won't say dire straits, but certainly severely weakened. And in the region, and let me be very, very brief here. There are 5 things that I'm going to address very quickly that I think in some measure challenge your optimism. One is, as my colleagues have said, we have historically been about preventing the presence of extra hemispheric actors. Yet today, it's probably true that the presence of extra hemispheric actors is extraordinary, much more than we really understand. The presence of Russia, the presence of China, and the presence of Iran throughout the region. Secondly, as I was saying, the fighting against the expansion of authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is a major current in the region. And here, Luis Fleischman praised President Bukele. I'm not so sure that we ought to be praising this trade-off between security and rights, even though they may be effective. But it's not a question of effectiveness versus legitimacy. It's really something that the hemisphere has stood for over the past, at least since 1994, which is the promotion of liberal democracy. Third, the penetration of organized crime. I don't think we fully understand how deep organized crime, the penetration of organized crime has been. I don't think there's a single country in the region that is not undergoing some kind of challenge. And this linkage, especially between drug trafficking and organized crime, that has essentially led to a collection of failures, Ecuador being one, but one country that we have completely neglected and we've completely forgotten about that is Haiti. Right here, now an hour away.
Un minuto.
Okay, I'll finish. And this leads to the real issue in the region, Richard, which is the enormous presence of collapsing, some might even call them failed states, right? And our inability now to work with these so-called failed states. And Haiti again is the extreme case, but there are others. I mean, maybe even countries like Venezuela and should be considered in that particular realm. And then finally, of course, the thing that's affecting every single country in the region, and which the U.S. has been showing dramatically an inability to deal with the challenges of mass immigration and the humanitarian crisis. It's not just the 8 million Venezuelans. It's now the large-scale migration of Colombians, the large-scale migration of Ecuadorians, the presence of Chinese immigrants and others, all going through Latin America. And in every single instance, immigration has become that old word that we used to use in international relations. This is now an intermestic factor that has become a huge challenge to democratic governance throughout the region. So let me end there. And again, I really appreciate your optimism, but I think that we may be looking at a very different continent.
Muchísimas gracias, Eduardo. And I must say, Richard, that Eduardo was the most eager person to participate in this forum because he called me last night at 3:42 a.m. to confirm. So he really wanted to be here. Thank you, Eduardo. Now we're going to call on Rodrigo Arboleda, que es miembro de la Junta Directiva del Inter-American Institute for Democracy, arquitecto graduado en MIT, militante de la causa del acceso universal a la digitalización, jefe corporativo de empresas públicas con cobertura en América Latina, como es el caso de Ogden. Bienvenido, Rodrigo.
Well, thank you very much, Beatrice. I'm going to be very brief because I think that many of the things that we were supposed to say or have been already said. My analysis, and I'm sorry to disagree respectfully with Dr. Richard Feinberg, is that we are now confronted with the U.S. in deep crisis, in my opinion. The present campaign for presidential posts is a very clear demonstration of that crisis. And as a consequence also, we have the following countries that are not particularly interested in becoming such a good friend of the United States as we might think. Evidently, the usual subjects of Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Venezuela. Now we have Brazil and Mexico that are quasi going against the U.S., not as in a front basis as the previous ones. We have Chile, we have Honduras, and we have Colombia. That is almost 85% of the continent that are not a friendly elements to the United States or to the fight against organized crime. So I'm very sorry to disagree in this respectful manner, and evidently we have a problem that is going to become more complicated as the months go by. This is my very short contribution because everything else has been said. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo. Thank you so much. Now we are going to call upon Rodolfo Milani, who is a member of the board of the Inter-American Institute for Democracy. He graduated in the Thunderbird School of Global Management. He's a senior managing director at B. Riley Wealth Management, and he's the chair of the Miami Freedom Forum. Welcome, Rodolfo.
Thank you, Beatrice. Buenas tardes. Ladies and gentlemen, there are few topics that get me more upset than discussing U.S. policy in Latin America in this century. Our position towards the region can most charitably be explained as benign neglect. Our woke culture can simply not tolerate any policy towards the region which smacks of paternalism or colonialism. Historically, the U.S. has played a significant role in the affairs of countries south of its borders, often utilizing both diplomatic and military means to exert its influence. The Monroe Doctrine, a policy which was quite harsh about foreign involvements in the region, had been the guidepost for 200 years. Unfortunately, our State Department under John Kerry officially announced it dead in 2013. While the left tends to treat the Monroe Doctrine as a symbol of the imposition of U.S. hegemony, despite those divergent views, the right regards it as a defense of U.S. strategic interests in the hemisphere. Despite those divergent views, the Monroe Doctrine deserves reviewed attention. Revisiting it should lead us to ask anew how to appropriately engage with our neighbors in Latin America, a task made even more imperative today by the troubling and often unnoticed activities of China, Russia, and Iran in the hemisphere we share. Chinese-funded projects in the region confront the weakness of Latin American institutions, their vulnerability to corruption, and the self-exclusion by some governments from more traditional sources of loans and investment, all of which decrease the likelihood that the region will benefit from these projects. And politicians and businessmen hesitate to speak critically of Chinese behaviors out of fear that such talk will jeopardize the Chinese markets that they hope to access or the partnerships they hope to forge. The result is often that elites overestimate the probability of securing the hoped-for benefits from Chinese, while underestimating the risks. In recent decades, however, we have witnessed a shift in approach towards a more nuanced and cooperative engagement with Latin American nations, which has led to the signing of trade agreements, joint security initiatives, and efforts to promote sustainable development across the region. However, it is important to acknowledge that challenges remain in the U.S.-Latin America relationship. Issues such as drug trafficking, political instability, and corruption continue to pose significant obstacles to progress and stability in the region. The U.S. must continue to work with its partners in Latin America to address these challenges through dialogue, cooperation, and shared responsibility. And should a Chinese invasion of Taiwan lead to war with the U.S., the commercial presence and military relationships China has built in the Western Hemisphere will likely be used to disrupt U.S. deployment and sustainment flows. China would, for example, shut down the Panama Canal and the Straits of Magellan, attack U.S. space assets from the Western Hemisphere, or project forces against the U.S. from dual-use ports and other facilities in the region. But Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere is not the only concern. Threats posed by Iranian and Russian engagement are even more direct. Iran has worked through surrogate organizations such as Hezbollah to orchestrate terrorist operations, and just this past June, Iranian President Raisi traveled to Latin America, meeting and signing agreements with Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. Separately, Iran signed a defense cooperation agreement with Bolivia. Escalating tension with the U.S. in the Middle East only increases Iran's interest in expanding its re-engagement with the region. Russia, like Iran, has periodically sought to challenge the United States through partnerships with anti-U.S. regimes. The threats the U.S. faces in Latin America are real and pressing. They involve regimes, China, Russia, Iran, that undermine our interests in other regions of the world. What then should our response be? In the spirit of the original Monroe Doctrine, dialogue with the region over the activities of China, Russia, and Iran must convey a sense of solidarity and shared interests, not a U.S. imposition. In shaping the region's choices, the balance between U.S.-friendly democracies versus anti-U.S. populist regimes will become ever more important. The U.S. should also redouble its efforts to educate regional partners about the perils of Russian information operations, Iranian surrogate terrorist networks, and other threats. As the Monroe Doctrine turns 200, its continued success depends upon Latin America's choices rather than its obedience. If Latin America stands in solidarity with the U.S. against the new generation of extra-hemispheric threats, it'll be not because the U.S. demands it, but because the region recognizes that doing so is in its own self-interest. Today, approximately 18% of the U.S. population is Latino Americans, totaling more than 50 million people, mostly of Mexican and Central American background. It is high time that our State Department starts to prioritize Latin America.
Muchísimas gracias a Rodolfo Milani. Ahora vamos a pedirle a Francisco Endara Daza, que es un colega del Inter-American Institute for Democracy de origen ecuatoriano, ingeniero en sistemas con un minor en relaciones internacionales de la Universidad de San Francisco de Quito. Es asesor de tecnología y analista político. Fue candidato a la Asamblea Nacional del Ecuador en el año 2012. Bienvenido, Francisco.
Muchas gracias, Beatriz. Muchas gracias. Quiero agradecer al directorio del Inter-American Institute for Democracy por la invitación y agradecer a quienes nos escuchan. Voy a tratar de ser breve. Simplemente quiero referirme respecto a las relaciones de Estados Unidos y Ecuador, comenzando con el tema de que estamos hablando de la política exterior de los Estados Unidos hacia Latinoamérica, pero voy a referirme al inicio respecto a Ecuador. Y quiero resaltar un poco que las relaciones diplomáticas entre Ecuador y Estados Unidos están entre las más antiguas del hemisferio. Los Estados Unidos envió su primer representante al Ecuador en el año 1825. Y en el año 1839 los Estados Unidos y el Ecuador firmaron un tratado de paz, amistad, navegación y comercio. Es decir, son casi 200 años en los que esta relación ha perdurado entre Estados Unidos y Ecuador. Pero aquí quiero llamar un poco la atención de quienes nos escuchan, incluso del profesor Feinberg, porque hay que preguntarse qué es lo que está pasando con la política exterior de los Estados Unidos, que toda Latinoamérica está en una especie de conflicto, tanto ideológico como político. ¿Y por qué por qué resalto este punto? Porque hay que recordar un poco que en diciembre del año 2014 el presidente Obama anunció algo interesante que sería un cambio para la política exterior de los Estados Unidos, que era normalizar las relaciones de Estados Unidos con la dictadura de Cuba. Incluso cuando se proclamó esto, no se mencionaba de Castro como un dictador, sino que en los propios Estados Unidos se mencionaba al dictador Castro como presidente. En el mayo del año 2015, durante la presidencia de Obama, también se eliminó a Cuba de la lista de los países patrocinadores del terrorismo en el mundo. En julio del 2015 se abre la embajada de Estados Unidos en La Habana y Cuba abre una embajada en Washington, D.C. De ahí en adelante los Estados Unidos y Cuba firman una serie de memorandos de entendimiento, de diálogo, que no han demostrado más que los Estados Unidos se ha dejado engañar hábilmente por la dictadura más antigua del continente, la dictadura cubana, mientras las violaciones a los derechos humanos en ese país subsisten, y no solo eso. Mientras los Estados Unidos le ha dado un respiro a la dictadura cubana, está aprovechado el tiempo para atacar a los países y democracias de Latinoamérica con el proyecto del socialismo del siglo XXI. Y por eso mencionaba el Ecuador, porque el Ecuador ha sido durante 10 años la víctima de estos ataques a la democracia en las manos del socialismo del siglo XXI, apoyado por la dictadura de Cuba, la dictadura de Venezuela, cuya imagen en el Ecuador es del partido Alianza País, o de Rafael Correa, que incluso dirigido por Rafael Correa, y que hicieron un cambio de constitución y nos pusieron una constitución un poco al estilo cubano. ¿Y por qué resalto esto? Simplemente para ir finalizando. ¿Y por qué resalto estas relaciones exteriores de Estados Unidos que han cambiado? Porque parecería ser que los Estados Unidos han olvidado que Cuba ha sido y sigue siendo el principal atacante de las democracias en Latinoamérica. Solo quiero recordar brevemente algunos aspectos nada más, que en abril del año 1959 ocurrió la primera incursión armada de Cuba en Panamá. Hubo otra incursión de Cuba, armada de Cuba, en junio de 1959. En Perú ocurrió en 1965, en Bolivia en el año 67, en Venezuela ocurrió en el año 1963, en Chile en agosto de 1986. El régimen militar chileno descubrió el arsenal más grande que haya poseído cualquier grupo subversivo en América Latina. Los pertrechos bélicos habían llegado transportados por embarcaciones pesqueras cubanas. Al respecto, quienes digan que estoy loco, porque para mucha gente parecería que Cuba es una pequeña isla que no hace nada, o bueno, la dictadura de la isla no hace nada, no dice nada, no ataca a nadie, son unos pobres inocentes palomas. Les recomiendo buscar el reportaje de la BBC en internet sobre las intervenciones de Cuba. También les recomiendo buscar o leer el libro Las guerras secretas de Fidel Castro de Juan Benemelis. Eso simplemente como resumen. Solo quería decir que esperemos que en algún rato los Estados Unidos desarrolle una política real, una política exterior con quienes han sido sus principales socios. Y no estoy diciendo porque considero que los Estados Unidos sea una especie de policía del mundo de Estados Unidos, porque eso es una tontería. Yo lo que considero es que Estados Unidos ha sido el principal socio comercial de Latinoamérica, y como decía en un inicio, ha sido el principal socio comercial de Ecuador. Y por esa razón, por las razones que siempre han habido de hermandad de Estados Unidos con Latinoamérica, deberían reverse los tratados y retomarse más acción para apoyar la democracia. Just to finish, I just like to address some words to Professor Feinberg. I just would like to say that, yeah, it's true that we could see the glass, the half of glass, and say we are optimists. But I prefer to think that we could see the glass in a more realistic way. A glass where you have turmoil and you have real problems facing and attacking to the United States and Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you. Vamos a pedir ahora a nuestro director ejecutivo, Carlos Sánchez Berzaín, que tome el micrófono. El doctor Sánchez Berzaín es abogado constitucionalista con maestría en ciencia política y una carrera pública que le llevó a ocupar las carteras de defensa, la presidencia y gobernación en su país de origen, Bolivia.
Gracias, Beatriz. Un saludo al doctor Feinberg y a todos los participantes. A lo largo de la historia de las relaciones entre Estados Unidos y América Latina, hay una primera cuestión que es concluyente. Son espacios complementarios, uno depende del otro, y la relación entre los Estados Unidos y América Latina es imprescindible. Lo segundo es que el poder, el tamaño, el desarrollo y la condición de potencia mundial después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial y de potencia unipolar después de la caída del muro de Berlín y la desaparición de la Unión Soviética, cuestión que ahora está en discusión por parte de Estados Unidos, hace mucho más fuerte la influencia de Estados Unidos en América Latina y viceversa. Y en función de esa realidad objetiva, yo conozco dos clases de política exterior de los Estados Unidos. Una política exterior partidista que cambia de acuerdo al partido que toma el poder en la Casa Blanca, y una política exterior de Estado. Y la época en que mejor le ha ido a Estados Unidos y América Latina es cuando Estados Unidos ha implementado política exterior de Estado. Y el mejor ejemplo de esa política exterior, el más reciente, es el que se da a partir de la Cumbre de las Américas de 1994 y que dura hasta inmediatamente después de los ataques terroristas del 11 de septiembre del año 2001, cuando el presidente Bush II empieza a cambiar y abandonar esa política exterior de Estado, abandonando la región, y después viene el presidente Obama que la cambia en 180 grados y todo lo demás se conoce. La diferencia entre la política exterior de Estado de los Estados Unidos de 1994 al 2001, 2002, digamos 2004, es que en ese momento Estados Unidos y la América Latina estaban mejor, porque esa política exterior de Estado estaba fundada en democracia, desarrollo sostenible, lucha contra el narcotráfico, libre mercado y una serie de principios que estructuraron aquello que se firmó el mismo 11 de septiembre del año 2001 en Lima, Perú, y que se llama Carta Democrática Interamericana, resultado de las cumbres de las Américas, y que es un tratado constitutivo con valor legal obligatorio y mandatorio para los países de América Latina, de todas las Américas, para Estados Unidos y para Canadá, en el que no deja discusión sobre lo que es la democracia en las Américas. La democracia en las Américas, de acuerdo a la Carta Democrática Interamericana, artículo primero, es un derecho de los pueblos y los estados y gobiernos tienen la obligación de promoverla y defenderla. Y en el artículo tercero da los elementos esenciales: respeto a la libertad y a los derechos humanos, separación e independencia de poderes, acceso al poder y su ejercicio con sujeción al Estado de Derecho, celebración de elecciones libres y justas fundadas en sufragio universal como expresión de la soberanía popular y libre organización política. Entonces, la discusión es, ¿por qué en el siglo XXI hay un cambio en las políticas exteriores de los diferentes países y hay un cambio en el que las dirigencias políticas y las políticas exteriores de las Américas están tolerando a las dictaduras que son anómalas en el marco jurídico, legal e internacional que regula las Américas? La política exterior de los Estados Unidos, cuando es de tipo partidista, refleja posiciones internas de diferentes presiones que se ejercen dentro del partido que toma el gobierno, pero los resultados son nefastos. Si comparamos la situación de Estados Unidos en materia migratoria del año 94 al año 2004, al año 2024, esta es una situación en la que hay una crisis que puede ser bien el resultado de ese cambio de política exterior. Si vemos el tema del narcotráfico, es mucho más grave. Pasamos de un éxito en la lucha contra el narcotráfico en la década de los 90 hasta el Plan Colombia 2004, digamos 2010, y después en una tolerancia a los narcoestados que se expanden, porque hoy día Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia y Nicaragua son narcoestados declarados. Si vemos el tema en función de lo que es la seguridad de los Estados Unidos y la seguridad regional y la penetración de factores externos a lo que es el intercambio interamericano, vemos un fracaso absoluto de lo que es la defensa de la democracia. Entonces, el tema en el que yo quiero incidir es que no importa cuál sea la política que Estados Unidos defina como política exterior para América Latina, pero debería ser una política de Estado que procure no cambiar cuando cambia el partido que controla la Casa Blanca, porque eso afecta totalmente, no solamente el destino de gobiernos y pueblos, sino de la región entera en el ámbito social, político y económico, como lo demuestran hoy día la permanencia de la dictadura de Cuba con una crisis humanitaria, la crisis en Venezuela con otra crisis humanitaria, dictadura, la dictadura de Nicaragua, el narcoestado y dictadura de Bolivia y los 4 gobiernos paradictatoriales absolutamente antinorteamericanos que tienen con Petro en Colombia, con López Obrador en México, con Lula en el Brasil y con Boric en Chile.
Le agradecemos estas reflexiones a nuestro director ejecutivo y le pedimos al profesor Feinberg que por favor reaccione a todos estos comentarios que ha habido a lo largo de la tarde de personas de diferentes países, que hemos tenido aquí gente de Estados Unidos, de Bolivia, de Colombia y también de Ecuador y de Cuba. De Argentina, que abrió.
Venezuela, tú eres China.
Sí. Bien.
and so many times over these many decades, I think is just a refusal to look inside those countries and to understand the nature of authoritarian resilience, which we see not only in the Western Hemisphere, but in Asia and in parts of Eastern Europe and elsewhere. These fellows know how to maintain themselves in power. Let's not blame international relations for that. They have instruments of control which are proving they will not last forever, but they're very efficacious, at least in the medium run. Well, we all see the world through our own prisms. When I walk around Latin America, I see in Brazil elections at all levels, municipal, federal, and provincial. I see the same thing in Argentina. I see the same thing in Uruguay. I see the same thing in Paraguay. I saw Argentina. You may or may not like the recent outcomes, but there were certainly plenty of choices for the people to choose. A beautiful and moving display of democratic sentiment at the recent funeral ceremonies for President Sebastián Piñera in Chile, in which all the major political forces, including, of course, Boric, praised the former president. A beautiful display of civic virtue. And then moving up, we may not like the current government of Colombia or Ecuador, but these were open elections that were contested and they were internationally observed. I'm sorry, you may not like the outcome, but this is what liberal democracy is about. And then moving up to Central America, which of course is more mixed, but Costa Rica, Panama is going through some tribulations. But at the end of the day, I suspect that democracy will continue. And by the way, in the Caribbean, yes, Haiti has for decades, I think since its origins, has been a very extremely troublesome failed state now, if you wish. But how about Caribbean? Solid. How about the Dominican Republic? Recently there, which wasn't always, of course, a democracy, successfully transitioned to democracy. The governing party just won 80%, I think, or so of the seats in local elections, and the current president will probably be legitimately democratically reelected. Now, Mexico, of course, is a very complicated case, but I think now what are we seeing? We're seeing two well-educated, technically competent women competing for the presidency. I didn't hear any mention of any of these processes in the laments of most of the commentators. So that's the world that I see. Now, in terms of U.S. policy, yes, let's mention his name, Donald Trump. Is he a hiccup, or is he a major discontinuity in American foreign policy? And we'll learn this on November 5th of this year. Now, and that will drive a lot of changes potentially in inter-American relations. It's certainly true worldwide that when a country like the United States seems to move dramatically from one ideology to another, that creates uncertainty, unreliability. Is the United States a reliable ally? And those are questions being raised worldwide today in every foreign ministry. What do we do if the disruptor returns to the White House? This is a huge problem for current foreign policymakers who know that in the back of their minds, all the people they're meeting with, they're thinking, how much longer will liberal democracy remain in power in America? So yes, a severe problem. Another problem, several people referred to the overconcentration of decision-making in the White House vis-a-vis the State Department. There's been a long-term trend. I think it's become exaggerated under Biden. I see Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, often acting as though he's the operational Secretary of State. I think that's inappropriate. The role of the NSC should be policy coordination and the presentation of options to the president rather than running around the world negotiating the details of current diplomatic spats. So yeah, I agree. I think this is a problem. Now, why has this occurred? Well, partly it's the result of bureaucratic growth, et cetera. We see this worldwide, executives becoming more influential. But partly it's because, let's face it, the State Department, and I saw this myself in the White House, a president wants results quickly, and he wants some successes within a 4 to 8 year time frame. State Department often doesn't feel that sense of urgency. And therefore, when the president doesn't get the advice that he's seeking, he'll bring in his own people. And we've seen this under Democrats and Republicans over now decades. So it's a long-term trend. Why doesn't the whole bureaucracy pay more attention to Latin America? So break it down. The State Department does, the Western Hemisphere Bureau does, but the Defense Department, where are the Defense Department assets? In Latin America? No, a tiny little deployment through Southcom. The real assets, of course, are Europe, NATO, and Asia. And that's therefore the bureaucracy, the huge bureaucracy, $1 trillion annual bureaucracy, the Department of Defense, is not thinking much about the Western Hemisphere. The intelligence community, I could say the same thing. And if you're looking at global trade flows, if you leave aside Mexico, then the action is heavily Europe, and the growth, the spectacular growth, is in Asia. So the Department of Commerce, USTR, US Treasury, where are they focusing mainly? And yes, it's not Latin America. So when the president calls the National Security Council, the National Economic Council, and people state their concerns, they're focused not entirely, but largely elsewhere. And that's it, guys. That is not going to change. That is not going to change. That's the weight of strategic prominence in the world, and that's where it is. Now, the United States is particularly we have problems, as I made clear, I hope, in my opening remarks, that the major countries in the region, by weight, by size, by influence, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, in recent years have not wanted to engage the United States in global diplomacy. AMLO, in particular, Mexico has a long history of mostly focusing on bilateral relations. Lula under Brazil is, marching around the world, playing global peacekeeper. Not to say that relations are bad, but you're not going to have a tight alliance structure there. And Argentina has talked about the United States going from one extreme to the next. We'll see what happens in Argentina. So again, it comes to partners. And when Tony Blinken wakes up in the morning and he says, I've got these 10 issues, burning issues on my plate, and I look around the world and who's going to work with me? Who's going to help me manage, if not solve, these 10 issues? Who do I have in Latin America? Well, the big countries, I don't know if I call Lula or if I call Milei or if I call AMLO, are they going to say, yeah, let's work together on this, seriously? Or am I going to hear from Lula, well, we're pursuing this sort of non-alignment, and then I'm going to hear from Bolsonaro, from Milei, well, I'm still busy getting my administration together. Okay, fine, call you later. And AMLO, well, I really don't have time for global diplomacy. So, and I don't want to be seen to be too close to the United States. So those are the realities that the White House sees, that a president or the National Security Council sees in the hemisphere when every morning Blinken or Jake Sullivan get up and think about, okay, where am I going to allocate my time, my very limited time and the time of the president on a worldwide basis? And then how active should the U.S. be in the region? Most of you seem to be calling for a greater degree of American activism. Well, I also like that myself personally. But, as soon as the U.S. does something, there are other people who say interventionism, imperialism, strong-handed tactics. So in every case, you sort of have to look for the balance and decide, how do you best achieve your objectives without, arousing too much of a counter reaction. But the very strong pushback against too much of a U.S. presence, I think, is something we have to keep in mind. Why isn't there a Marshall Plan for the Americas? Why isn't there a European Union for the Americas? because it would be a non-starter, not only in the US, of course, but in most of Latin America. What does it take to get into the EU? You have to conform your national legislation to hundreds of EU qualifications. Can you imagine any Latin American country agreeing to do that with the United States? Hard to imagine. So when we talk about there should be major strategic initiatives that integrate the region, I think we have to just be aware of these very powerful underlying historical currents. Yes, there's pushback, as Eduardo mentioned, from both the right and the left in Latin America, sort of criticizing liberal democratic institutions. Absolutely. I'm sure you've documented many of those in your research, but this is, as you very well know, Eduardo, this is hardly new. And in fact, if anything, it seems to me, relatively speaking, and of course, we're generalizing across 35 countries here, but generally speaking, I think these attacks on liberal democracy are less cogent, less powerful, gaining less domestic support than might have been the case in previous decades. But yes, of course, there are authoritarianism strong in the Hispanic tradition, if you will, and we should certainly be well aware of it. Then finally, a lot of you talked about the issue of crime and counter-narcotics and narcotics, et cetera. Well, the United States has had a counter-narcotics policy since at least Nixon in the 1970s, and much of the Department of Justice continues to work on these issues. There's a pretty large counter-narcotics budget sprinkled throughout the U.S. government. It's the central focus of Southcom. There's a large office, INL, in the State Department that works these issues, and of course, intelligence as well. So it's not like the U.S. is like not aware or not trying or hasn't been working over many, many years with governments in the region. So yeah, I mean, I personally have some qualms with some of the ways the U.S. goes about approaching it, but it's not as though the U.S. isn't very aware and very concerned about the transnational organized crime in the region. So I hope I've been able to respond to some of your comments. As Beatrice mentioned, I will be I will have my new residency in Florida, spending most of the year there, beginning shortly. And I very much look forward to more extensive conversations on all of these very cogent issues with many of you in the months and years ahead. And thank you, Beatrice, for facilitating this interchange.
Thank you to you for being part of this program. We await your instructions in order to give you a very warm welcome here in Florida, and particularly at the Institute. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to the 1.3 million people that were watching this event through Infobae. Thank you to Infobae also. We are going to regroup with another important event on the state of the prisoners, political prisoners in Latin America. On March the 5th from 10:30 to 12:30. Please don't miss that event because it's going to be very important. Thank you.